trust. Because if you're talking about safely self-managing and allowing autonomous teams, then, and this came up in the last call a lot, which I like, is people can no longer see the employees sitting at a desk, producing widgets or outputs. Because what sort of leadership is required in a time of exponential change and the impact of exponential technologies. Such a volume of data and information, you can't do that, yourself. It's a management report once a month doesn't cut it. It's real time, it's distributed. In order for people to actually deliver on the organization's ambitions in a distributed way, then of course you need a binding purpose, which is we've been talking about already. In order to discover, for people to actually discover, how to respond and how to solve these problems in times of implementing large systems and large transformation is oftentimes past, and now it's with sort of three different dimensions or sub aspects. In this case, in all of them there's tension. So the leadership ability, which is required even more in these exponential times, is the ability to manage these tensions. So there's how do you maintain a strong, clear vision and enable adaptation? How do you give autonomy to individuals and teams and have some semblance of control? And where's the balance of it? And then where do you challenge people to stretch, and when do you have the wisdom to support? How do you give the overall umbrella of where we're going? How do you have rigid-ish walls to keep people sort of in the right direction? And what's the foundation support? So it's another way to make those changes. And one thing I love doing is what's called big room planning. And this is an aspect of scaled agile, which is basically you come together, particularly in IT development, it can be applied to anything. Come together, preferably off-site for 2 days. I've seen it done in a day as well, but you start with having the leadership of the different functions present on a quarterly basis the strategy and vision moving forward. I also love to enforce bringing in actual customers into these. There needs to be some clarity of what you can do and what you can't do. Value statements I find are really helpful here as well. And particularly what I like about value statements, although people rarely do it, is to really make it explicit on how we should not behave. So if we say trust is the value, like every organization says, okay, fine, but how does that translate to a behavior? And in particular, what sort of behaviors do we not want to see? So this is again a way of giving some of those boundaries on the outside. And if you want to keep sort of pushing the boundaries, then you should have some sort of exception process. So if you have the outer boundaries, how can people break the boundaries? Because if there's no way for you to have that conversation on adaptation, then people get frustrated and they'll either break the boundaries without telling you, or they will not sort of push the envelope on innovation. Don't assign people to things that they just literally aren't able to do, because then if they fail, then it's actually your fault and not their fault. Not like we have to be there all the time to do. Because if everyone gets into the habit of coming back and say, oh, I'm under stress, I need help, I need cuddles, then they're never going to themselves be in a place where they can truly safely self-manage.
The way we do things now is based on the problems that we've had in the past. Are we organized still to continue delivering concrete results in uncertainty? That we have to work at 3 levels at the same time, and all of them have a slightly different mentality. The agile way of working affects the rest of the organization as well, and so teams are forming throughout organizations. What I'm seeing is that those teams can't be static. We need to be able to organize ourselves in a way that the teams can quickly and preferably on their own reorganize into different teams to address different problems over time and sometimes simultaneously. The challenge for leadership in that is, on the one side, creating effective teamwork within each team, but on the other, balancing that against the overall direction and causality of what we're trying to achieve as a whole organization. And the driving force is around the intent of the organization. And I call it that because I don't mean strategy. I don't mean a strategic roadmap or a vision, not even values. For me, the intent is about doing rather than being, focusing on purpose and outcomes. And that gives us the flexibility then on how we do things. So what this also means is that management is dead. We need to repurpose our managers to no longer govern and control, but to integrate those teams, integrate what we're doing across the organization. Or again, depending on the skills and talents of that manager, to coach the teams, how to work effectively within the teams or amongst themselves. And also specialists, domain and knowledge specialists who can advise and guide those teams to deliver best. For me, the single most important thing is around communication. It needs to be, however, not just one directional from leadership to the teams. It's multi-directional, it's quick feedback, it's scenario appropriate channels, messages, the depth of the communication, and so on. Teams understand, and individuals, their role in the bigger picture, the consequence of their actions and decisions on the rest of the organization, and also understanding the roles of everybody else in the organization. This arrange ourselves not in silos for managing process and managing activity, but around purpose, where we have policies that are in place that are absolutely clear and not overcomplicated, but they enable and facilitate the flow of activity and information, as opposed again to controlling and governing. Right things are being measured for outcomes as opposed to measuring for activity. Creative ways to subtly enable that change in a way that creates an excitement and a willingness in the teams and an understanding. Certainly the culture is to a large degree the determinant of how successful we're going to be, but we can't engineer a culture. However, if we have a philosophy that we share, a philosophy of being a curious organization, where we're driven by an intent, but we allow failure, we allow dead ends, we provide some level of leeway to the teams to make mistakes. We break down the organizational silos. Boundaries need to be porous. We need to have quick and easy access to other teams within the organization in the interests of delivering effectively. The whole question of managing change has become moot. Is no longer a linear process of moving us from point A to point Z, which is a predefined outcome. There are too many constantly moving pieces. The culture and the purpose of the organization is what's going to give it stability in the future. And the way that we enable the teams is by creating that participation. I advocate seeing an organization as a busload of people, where everybody's talking, there might be a driver, but we're all contributing to finding the route forward and finding our way, as opposed to the way we used to do it, where it was the horse and trailer kind of situation, a leadership group dragging a trailer load of people behind who are cut off from the leadership group.
Employee mental health and mental fitness has been reaching pandemic levels before COVID. Really, at its elementary level, the leadership role is to balance the demands placed on employees with the resources available to them. Not just physical resources like clear roles, good job descriptions, clear strategies, a good, well-defined vision. We're talking at physical resources like tools and equipment and so forth. We also talk about psychological resources, like, for instance, teamwork, good culture, good communication, role clarity, good career paths, team relationships with supervisors. Those are actually psychological resources. And it's about flow. It's about organizational alignment. We are talking about physical demands, like the pace and amount of work that people have to do, but also cognitive demands and also emotional demands. And it was interesting to note when we did a bit of research in just this COVID period, that emotional load can add an incredibly high stressor in organizations, generally speaking. So, but that there is some alignment, that a culture of whatever kind we want to define or formulate that speaks to the strategy of an organization. In other words, if you want to craft a roadmap or you want to craft a vision, for instance, to be socially responsible, that you also ensure that your values of the organization, the behaviors of the leadership also align with that. 4 different potential states in an organization, and this is where we find the eustress state, that state for high performance. We call it work engagement, if you wish, where you have high energy and high work devotion. So the motivationally people are really with the program, and they have all the resources to execute properly on what they want to do. When we start to get an imbalance in resources and demands, in other words, we talk about restructurings and getting more done with less people and less money and so forth, we find that the high performing people start to move into the overcommitment space. And all that happens there is that employees, they're very committed to the organization, so their work devotion remains high, but they lose their effort recovery. And this is where the psychological safety starts to go out the window. If nothing happens and this balance isn't restored, the overcommitment phase starts to move into the burnout phase. Now, the finding hasn't changed. The stats are still at 15% highly engaged employees and 85% disengaged employees. Now, that, I'm afraid to say, is a serious indictment on the quality of leadership. But burnout is where your high-performing employees end up. So it's really like cutting your nose to spite your face by not managing this properly. A tool that it's quite nicely validated too. It's based on neuroscience. It's not a change management model for anybody that thinks that it is. It is really a tool that equips employees to fully process and engage what they've been through the COVID pandemic. In other words, some people may fear losses, or financial losses, job losses. Some may encounter slight changes. Some people may have lost people and so forth. People bring that energy and those concerns to the workplace. We can't tell them what the change means to them. It's about letting them figure it out for themselves and then take up the accountability to deal with that as best as they can.
Surely measuring capability is a vital step before making a decision to retrench.
As for any change process. So because we know people go through a change curve, we know that it requires more energy to get back up again, because we lose competence, we lose skills and so forth. And I guess it's no strange thing to know how many of these change processes actually fail. So we probably shouldn't be talking about productivity increases when we want to retrench people. But so if it's about really just saving the business, it's one thing to do that. But if it's about just saving costs for the next fad or fashionable thing, it very seldom brings a good result. The late generations don't like this idea of accountability. There's a lot more entitlement going on. It does ask more questions of us to help them see their ability to respond to what life demands of them. Because it's about stepping up to that. It's not about hiding from that and so forth. But the thing is, it's one thing to say you must. It's a different thing to help and give them the tools so that they could make that choice different.
We looked into the employee assistance program and the medical aid and looked for trends to see how the workforce was doing, to see how much change they could take on. So we try to, in a way, quantify change resilience or change readiness. And one of the things was that we saw in the category from 18 to 24 that was the biggest percentage use of antidepressants. Sure, a warning signal that we're not really spending, effort on helping people to cope with, the stress and the environment. And many years ago, we used to have communications skills and presentation skills and conflict management courses, and management had used to work you through those courses as a standard.
We create our world and we create our realities with the language we use and the words we speak. And so it's actually quite funny that we talk about humanity and making business better and good society. they continue using words like human resources and human capital, and as if human beings are just production factors. The employee support programs, often they are there to tick boxes, so that we can actually take care of the governance requirements. I'm being pessimistic here, but if the governance is taken care of, then we should be okay. But we don't really engage and measure what is the state of our employee engagement globally. And even under normal circumstances, the research we've done globally shows that if somebody's promoted into a new job, for instance, or somebody steps into a new role, generally at a senior management level, it takes about 18 months for that person to undo his previous knowledges and skills and competencies and get proficient with a new way of his new role. In South Africa, we've twice done the study, about 15,000 samples in the research, that person job fit issues became the biggest driver of disengagement and turnover intention.
I read a metric recently that the average tenure of a chief digital officer these days is 9 months.
What the heck?
In my world, we're digital and transformation. It seems like executives who don't want to be the change themselves, they hire someone. You be the digital change. We're not going to give any mandate. We're not going to give any teeth, but you need to transform the organization. And of course, they come in and they get crushed. They annoy everyone, and then they get spit out from the machine.
You measure the organizational misalignment between personal values and organizational values and how it's experienced. And you see anything more than a 10% discrepancy gives you a toxic environment, because if you have a fundamental disbelief in certain things, you will act like that. So you can't change behavior at a behavior level. You have to change it at a values and belief level, which is much harder to do. It's a deeply held belief that brings about that result. And I think sometimes we underestimate that. I want to also, if I might piggyback on your words, Helen, we do too much of the mechanics of the business and we don't look at the dynamics of it. The human beings in organizations are not complicated. They are complex, which means they are not so predictable and much harder to manage to get results from. Whereas systems and processes could be very complex, but they are predictable and they are linear. So it's easier to fix that. And because it's easy to fix, that's where we go. So what do? We find wonderful ERP systems, and I've been a party to that one before. And then we give it a label as best in class, and we're going to implement that. And you wonder why in Benin or in Cameroon or in Papua New Guinea, this ERP system isn't working.
We're operating on fear because we have to keep the organization going. So it's the response in fear is always to try and control things. And you forget that people are not, they're the one thing you ain't going to control. There's
innovation has, the innovation process asks for a cross-functional team that already there, it's not easy to work with each other. The frustration levels in a proper innovation process are very high because there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of trying and making mistakes, and are you doing it right, and we can't fail this, and so there's all these personalities that in a proper cross-functional team that have to try and work together and come to a different innovation. And at the best of times it's hard. So if you're doing it from a very low emotional state and emotional safety, then how are you going to innovate?
So what's really important about what you're saying from my perspective is if one applies some neuroscience to this process, and it's the way change happens, it's the learning process. The minute we encounter fear or we encounter stress in an organization, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive decision making, reduces down to 40% efficacy. You put people through an innovation process or through a change process or a restructuring, and then you ask them to make life decisions, which is a function of decision making in the complex brain. But you put them into the fight and flight freeze brain, in the primitive brain, and then you expect them to make good decisions.
They realized that there is no differentiation. All the companies are using the same words. They all trust, they all say, so they all have them on posters, it was completely meaningless. So I dug up one of these slides, and what they did discover was, because this is the scores from, the top two scores I think are from Glassdoor, the employee rating platform. Because when they studied all the words used in the value statements, they realized there was no differentiation based on performance. Then they went to Glassdoor and John Lewis versus W.H. Smith. It actually doesn't matter what the brands are. You can see on the first two top that the employees are rating the companies higher. Then there's you could call it a correlation to the NPS or the likelihood to recommend. That's coming from a different thing. And then the most meaningful thing is they found also the Glassdoor was the CEO approval. And this goes back to the behaviors that it didn't matter really what the words were that the company was saying that their values were, but what it really, really, really mattered is what the leader or the leadership was authentically living, breathing, and creating that experience that was in line. So basically, people trusted what was going on.
Their executives don't understand, and in fact underestimate greatly, is the effect of their own behavior on the way the organization responds to the stated core values, for example. Employees look to senior management for clues as to how they should behave. If they detect that senior executives aren't in fact living up to the values, then they say to themselves, well, why should we?
Yeah, it's wonderful to have this value and all these statements of behaviors. You should also have the practices to make sure that this thing comes to life. So, but you have these hypo programs, okay, high performing people. So 30% of people are hypos. What do you do with the other 70% that are useless? How do you include them, or are you excluding them? For instance. And then she looked at me and said, you can't say things like that. Yeah, but so just be congruent, be authentic. So if you say this is my value, then have the practices to demonstrate that. Don't have something because it sounds like a nice thing, and then you have contradictory practices running in the organization. I think what happens
even it can actually destroy trust. That if you come up with these false statements, it'd almost be better if you didn't say anything. Just don't say anything.